Welcome in, everybody. Ready to dive into something pretty special. Today, we're taking a look at a film that really shook things up. A film that redefined what cinema could be back in 1959. Alain Resnais' Hiroshima Mon Amour. But we're going even deeper than just watching it. We're going behind the scenes,
Yeah.
to understand why it made such a huge impact.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. We've got this incredible snapshot of how people felt right when Hiroshima Mon Amour premiered. We're looking at this roundtable discussion published in Cahiers du Cinema, which at the time was like the film journal. And some of the biggest names in French New Wave cinema were involved. Godard, Rivette, Rohmer. They're all chiming in, trying to understand what Resnais had created.
It's kind of like we're eavesdropping on them, right? Like we're sitting in on this conversation with the most influential film critics of the time, all buzzing about this movie, a little confused maybe because it was so different. Godard even said it felt inconceivable when he thought about how films were usually made.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is they were all blown away by how Resnais, along with screenwriter Marguerite Duras, brought together literature and cinema in a way that had never been done before. Usually, if a critic calls a film literary, it's kind of a dig. Like it's trying too hard to be wordy instead of visual.
Right? Like it's not embracing its own medium.
Exactly. But with Hiroshima Mon Amour, they see something totally different.
Mhm.
Kast, one of the critics, actually argues that this film takes that whole literary insult and turns it upside down.
It's ambitious, sure, but it also pushes the boundaries of what cinema can do. They even compare it to Louis Deluc, one of the pioneers of French Impressionist cinema who had that poetic lyrical approach.
So it's not just telling a story, it's about how that story is told visually.
Hmm.
And speaking of visuals, we can't talk about Hiroshima Mon Amour without talking about Sergei Eisenstein. Oh, of course, the master of montage. Rivette makes this really sharp connection between Resnais and Eisenstein. He argues that both filmmakers used montage, that art of editing, to actually create meaning.
Mm.
Not just cutting from one shot to the next, but using those cuts to create a rhythm, you know, to evoke emotions, even intellectual ideas.
Okay, so for someone who's not a film expert, could you break down how montage works in Hiroshima Mon Amour? Like, what am I seeing on screen?
Imagine, okay, you're watching a scene where a woman is walking down a street in Hiroshima. Now, a traditional film might show this as one long, smooth shot as she walks, but Resnais uses montage to break that scene up into fragments. So you might see a close-up of her hand, then suddenly you see a flash of a building destroyed by the bomb, then back to her face, all in a matter of seconds.
He's jumping around in time and space.
Exactly, and by doing that, he's crafting this kind of visual poetry that reflects the way memory works,
Yeah.
fragmented.
Uh,
And the way trauma can make you feel disoriented. It's like he's saying, hey, we don't experience the world in a neat, linear way. All these impressions, feelings.
it's like he took the language of film and transformed it into something completely new.
Yeah, and Rohmer, another critic, takes that idea even further. He claims that Resnais is and this is a big statement, the first modern filmmaker of the sound film.
Whoa, that's a bold claim. What did he mean by that?
Well, he's putting Resnais up there with the pioneers of modern art, like the Cubist painters and the writers of the American modernist novel. Think about Picasso's Guernica with its shattered figures and distorted perspectives, or Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury with its stream of consciousness narration that jumps all over the timeline.
So Resnais is doing for film what those artists did for painting and literature, breaking the rules, changing the game, pushing us to see the world in a different way.
Yeah, exactly. And Romer points out that it's not just visuals either. Resnais uses sound in this modern way too, playing with silence, overlapping dialogue, even the way he uses music. It's more about evoking a feeling than being literal. He's not just telling a story, he's crafting an experience.
So you've got this totally new approach to film form, but what about the story itself, the content? The critics seemed pretty fascinated by Emmanuelle Riva's performance as the main character, the female protagonist.
Oh yeah, they were definitely drawn to her performance and how it fit into this new way of making films. Rivette makes a really interesting observation about her character. He says she's not irrational, but not rational. Now, that might sound confusing, but I think it gets to the heart of how Resnais portrays trauma.
Okay, help me out here. What does it even mean to be not rational?
Well, Rivette's suggesting that Riva's character isn't just being illogical. She's not out of control. It's more like she's operating outside of the typical ways we explain psychology. Remember, she's going through this process of rebuilding her life after an incredibly traumatic experience, and the film captures that feeling.
Well,
that sense of being fragmented and disoriented.
So her inner world is shattered, just like the film's style is fragmented.
Exactly. And this ties into the film's exploration of time and memory, which are really central themes. Domarchi, another one of the critics, actually goes as far as to call Hiroshima Mon Amour a documentary on Emmanuel Riva's character.
Wait, a documentary? But she's a fictional character.
I know, right? It's a bold statement.
Yeah.
But I think what Domarchi's getting at is that the film isn't really focused on plot, you know? It's more about exploring her inner world, her consciousness, with all its complexities and contradictions. It's like a deep dive into her mind.
Like we're experiencing her memories and emotions right alongside her.
Exactly. And Rivette compares the film's structure to Jorge Luis Borges, that Argentinian writer known for mind-bending stories that mess with time and reality. He says Hiroshima Mon Amour has this circular structure where the ending seems to loop back to the beginning, blurring the lines between the past and the present.
So the film isn't afraid to experiment with how it tells the story.
No, not at all. But wait a minute. We've talked about form, we've talked about character, but we can't forget the setting. This film takes place in Hiroshima, a city forever marked by the atomic bomb. And that raises a big question. What about the politics of all this? Is Hiroshima Mon Amour trying to send a message?
Yeah, because this isn't some abstract art piece, right? It's dealing with a very real and horrific historical event.
And Godard, never one to avoid a good debate, throws out this provocative question. Is Hiroshima Mon Amour a left-wing film or a right-wing film? He's really asking, where does this film stand politically? And the critics' responses are really interesting.
Okay, let's hear it. What do they say?
Well, there's a spectrum of opinions. Rivette defends what he calls the film's aesthetic leftism. He's saying that the very form of the film, its embrace of fragmentation, its rejection of traditional storytelling that's inherently radical, and therefore, in his view, aligns with the leftist perspective.
But didn't Rohmer say that modernism doesn't have to be political?
He did, and he seems to think that labeling the film in those terms is kind of missing the point. Doniol-Valcroze, another critic, brings up how Resnais actually made some very specific choices to avoid overt political messages. Like, the film reveals that the female protagonist was punished after the war for having a relationship with a German soldier, which makes it harder to interpret the film as a simple anti-war statement.
So it's more about exploring the human experience of war and trauma without pushing a particular political agenda.
Exactly. And this is where the idea of Resnais' terrible tenderness comes in.
Now, I've been wondering about that phrase. Terrible tenderness sounds kind of contradictory. What does it actually mean in the context of the film?
Domarchi explains it beautifully. He argues that Resnais has this unique way of looking at society, seeing it as kind of anonymous, you know, where individuals get lost, they're powerless against these bigger forces. He connects this back to Resnais' earlier documentary, Night and Fog, which was about the Nazi concentration camps.
Ugh, that film is haunting. So powerful.
Exactly. And Domarchi argues that in Night and Fog, Resnais doesn't focus on individual villains, right? Instead, he shows how the concentration camps were the result of a system, a bureaucratic machine that dehumanized and destroyed people. And that same awareness of human vulnerability in the face of these vast impersonal systems is present in Hiroshima Mon Amour.
So, terrible tenderness is about acknowledging suffering without simple explanations or political slogans, right? It's about recognizing that life is fragile.
Exactly. It's about seeing the world clearly, acknowledging the horrors, but also recognizing the beauty and the resilience of the human spirit.
It sounds like Resnais is trying to capture something truly profound about what it means to be human after World War II.
And Rivette adds another layer to this terrible tenderness idea by connecting it to Resnais' filmmaking technique. He suggests that Resnais confronts abstraction with abstraction. He juxtaposes seemingly unrelated things, like those documentary images of Hiroshima with a fictional love story, to arrive at a concrete reality. It's like he's saying we can't understand the complexities of the world, the horrors of war, the mysteries of love, through simple explanations or straightforward narratives. We need a new language, a new way of seeing, to grasp the truth of those experiences.
It's like the film itself is a montage, weaving together these different layers of meaning and emotion to create something really powerful and moving.
Exactly. And this leads us to a key question posed by Godard, he asks. Does Emmanuel Riva leave, or does she stay at the end of the film? Now, this question goes beyond just the plot. He's really asking, what does it all mean? What are we left with after this journey through memory, trauma, and love?
I love that question. So, do we get an answer?
Rivette jumps in with this brilliant response. He suggests it doesn't actually matter whether she leaves or stays. He calls Hiroshima Mon Amour a circular film, because the end circles back to the beginning. It creates this infinite loop. He compares it to the work of Borges, with those labyrinthine structures and that blurring of time. The point is, the meaning isn't fixed. It's open to interpretation.
So the film isn't giving us easy answers. It's making us think about these big questions about memory, love, and what it means to be human.
Exactly. Rivette emphasizes that Hiroshima Mon Amour is about reflection, reflecting on the past, the present, and the things that worry us about the future. And through that reflection, time itself becomes fluid, open to different interpretations.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to how layered and complex Hiroshima Mon Amour is. It's so much more than just a love story. It's a film that still has something to say to us today, but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
You're absolutely right. There's so much more to uncover. When we come back, we'll delve deeper into some of the specific techniques and themes that make this film so groundbreaking. Welcome back. It's pretty amazing how much one film can make you think, All these ideas and connections. We were just talking about Rivette comparing Resnais to Stravinsky, how both of them use contrast to make a unified work of art.
Yeah, I'm really starting to see how Hiroshima Mon Amour works on all these different levels. It's not just a love story, it's not just about history, it's about how Resnais brings all that together.
Right, exactly. Rivette emphasizes this idea that both Stravinsky and Resnais, they use contrast, they use opposition, and somehow through that, they find a deeper unity. Like, think about the way Resnais cuts between those smooth tracking shots, the camera just gliding through space, and then those sudden static shots where everything freezes.
Yeah, like he's breaking up the flow on purpose. But why do that? What does that do for the person watching?
Well, remember Stravinsky's definition of music. An alternating succession of exaltation and repose. Rivette sees that happening in Hiroshima Mon Amour. Those jarring cuts, those sudden shifts between movement and stillness, they create this feeling of unease, But they also grab your attention. They make you feel that fragmented nature of memory, how the past keeps interrupting the present.
So it's not just about looking cool, it's actually conveying a deeper meaning about time and memory. Which kind of brings me back to something else we were talking about. The whole debate about whether Hiroshima Mon Amour is a left-wing or right-wing film.
Yes, Godard's big question. It's really fascinating how the critics try to wrestle with the political side of this film. Rivette, as we said, he sees the form of the film itself as a radical statement. That rejection of traditional storytelling, embracing fragmentation, that's inherently challenging the status quo. And so, for him, that aligns with a leftist view.
But Rohmer wasn't so sure, right?
Yeah, Rohmer seemed to think that trying to put modern art into those neat little boxes is a little too simplistic. He sees modernism as something that goes beyond those traditional political labels. And Doniol-Valcroze makes a good point about Resnais actively choosing to avoid those clear-cut political messages. Like, remember, we learned that the female protagonist was punished after the war for having a relationship with a German soldier. That kind of complicates the idea that this is just a straightforward anti-war film.
So it's more about exploring the human side of war and trauma, regardless of your political beliefs.
Precisely. And that's where the idea of Resnais's terrible tenderness becomes so important.
I've got to admit, that phrase has been bugging me. Terrible tenderness. It seems kind of contradictory. So what does it actually mean when we're talking about this film?
Domarchi nails it, I think. He argues that Resnais has this very particular way of looking at society, seeing it as this kind of anonymous place where individuals are lost, powerless against these huge forces. And he connects this back to Resnais' documentary, Night and Fog, about the Nazi concentration camps.
Ugh, that film is so powerful. Haunting.
Right. And Domarchi says that in Night and Fog, Resnais doesn't go after individual bad guys.
Yeah.
He shows that those camps were the product of a system, this bureaucratic machine that just churned people up and destroyed them. And that same awareness, that sense of being vulnerable against these big impersonal systems, that's there in Hiroshima Mon Amour too.
So this terrible tenderness, it's about acknowledging the suffering, but without simplifying things, right? No easy answers, no political slogans. It's about seeing how fragile human life really is.
Exactly. It's about looking at the world with open eyes, seeing the horrors, absolutely, but not losing sight of beauty or resilience. The strength of the human spirit.
It sounds like Resnais is really trying to get at something deep about what it means to be human in a world that's just been through World War II.
And Rivette actually adds another layer to this terrible tenderness thing by connecting it to Resnais' film technique. He suggests that Resnais is confronting abstraction with abstraction, right? Putting these seemingly unconnected things together like documentary footage of Hiroshima and this fictional love story. And somehow through that, he gets at a concrete reality. It's like he's saying, look, we can't understand the really complicated stuff war, love through easy explanations. We need a new language, a new way of looking at things to get at the truth of it all.
So the film is kind of like a montage itself, bringing together these different levels of meaning, these emotions, to create a powerful whole.
Exactly. And this leads us to a really important question that Godard asks. Does Emmanuelle Riva leave or does she stay at the end? And this goes beyond the plot, right? He's really getting at what does it all mean? What are we left with after experiencing this journey through memory, trauma, and love?
Oh, that's such a good question. So do we get an answer?
Rivette gives us a really insightful response. He says it actually doesn't matter if she leaves or stays. He calls Hiroshima Mon Amour a circular film because the end kind of leads right back to the beginning, this infinite loop. He even compares it to Borges, right? With all those mazes and the way he plays with time. The point is, there's no one meaning. It's up to each person to decide.
So it's a film that wants us to think, not just give us answers. It pushes us to consider these big questions about memory, love, and what it means to be human.
Exactly. Rivette really emphasizes that this film is about reflection, thinking about the past, the present, and what worries us about the future. And through that, time itself becomes fluid, open to different interpretations.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. Hiroshima Mon Amour is so much more than just a love story. It's a film that still has so much to say to us today, though I feel like we've only just started to unpack it all.
You're right. There's so much more to explore. When we come back, we'll wrap up our discussion and look at the legacy of Hiroshima Mon Amour and what it means for us today.
Man, this has been quite the journey. We've talked about film history, philosophy, even music theory, all because of Hiroshima Mon Amour.
Yeah, it just goes to show how rich this film is, you know. Decades later, it's still sparking all these different conversations. But as we wrap up our deep dive, I think we need to ask, what's the legacy of Hiroshima Mon Amour? How has it stuck with us?
Right, because we've been talking about how groundbreaking it was back in '59, but does it still hold up today? Does it still have something to say to us now in the 21st century?
Well, you know, Rivette said that Resnais was the only one truly living in 1959. So if that's true, then how does a film that was so connected to its time speak to the future, to our present?
It's a big question, for sure. I mean, so much has changed since 1959. The world's a different place. Do you think people can still connect with the film?
I think so, absolutely. Because the things that worry Resnais in the film, you know, that fragmentation of memory, the struggle to figure out who you are after something traumatic, that feeling of being lost in the world that's becoming more and more abstract and impersonal, I actually think those anxieties are even stronger today.
I see what you mean. We're bombarded with information, politics are divisive, social media. It's a lot to process, a lot to feel anxious about.
Exactly. And Hiroshima Mon Amour, in a way, speaks to that feeling. It doesn't try to sugarcoat things. It forces you to face those complexities of life head on. No easy answers.
Which is refreshing, honestly. In a world that's always looking for easy answers and black and white, it's good to have something that challenges that.
It's true. The film doesn't tell you what to think. It asks questions. It wants you to think for yourself.
So for our listeners, why should they care about a film that came out over 60 years ago? What can they learn from this deep dive?
Well, I think Hiroshima Mon Amour shows us that great art doesn't have to have all the answers. It can provoke you. It can challenge your assumptions. It can help you see the world in a new way. And that's something valuable, no matter what year it is.
It's like the film is starting a conversation, you know, making us think about memory, trauma, the search for meaning in a world that's always changing.
Precisely. And it reminds us that those big questions, those human struggles, they're timeless. They're always relevant.
So if you haven't seen Hiroshima Mon Amour, do yourself a favor and check it out.
Even if you have seen it, maybe it's time to watch it again with fresh eyes. Think about everything we've talked about, how Resnais uses montage, how he blends past and present, those subtle things Emmanuelle Riva does in her performance.
Yeah, think about what Resnais was worried about back then and how those worries connect to what we're dealing with today. Let the film get you thinking about memory, trauma, and what it means to find meaning in a world that never stops changing.
It's a film that really stays with you.
And on that note, we'll leave you to think about the terrible tenderness of Alain Resnais' masterpiece. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.